So along the journey for me of becoming a householder, a father, as I began to have, the scope of my responsibilities became broader. And at some point, I think along, the path for many men in that same position where life becomes more complicated, you have more responsibilities, more people depend on you. At some point, if you're lucky enough, you'll start the process of kind of going in and recognizing, okay, some of the challenges and the dysfunction that I see in my life, potentially reside, somewhere within me, and my life is kind of mirroring something where dysfunction lives inside. And so we start to kind of take this proactive approach to, okay, what are some things that I can do? What are some operating, some outdated, like I talked about the fundamental operating system that I'll get into, but like, what are some things that I hold, what are some limiting beliefs or some behaviors, that are kind of holding me back? So at some point, I'm kind of recording this for my younger self or for men, because I developed a whole bunch of tools kind of as that loner DIY. Nobody knows what I'm going through, so there's no tools out there for me. Before I was able to find, therapy or plant medicine or men's group or, 12-step work, before I was able to find tools that really did help and recognize that nothing's unique about my experience, I kind of developed my own set of tools. And I think one that's really great to kind of explore how we operate is something that I developed called the pause in the storm. So, I've talked about the hero's journey on my channel a lot, and how, we're very much always in a place where life is going to present challenges and opportunities for us to evolve or to develop new skill sets or to look at things differently. And this has been written into many of the ancient myths, as long as we've been telling stories around the fire for, 50,000 years. And this common theme, and you can see it in movies like Superman or the Avengers, or really a lot of movies where like the protagonist is presented with a challenge that seems insurmountable until they change, until they learn, until they grow, until they change something, and then they come back, a stronger, different version of themselves, more prepared to handle whatever life's thrown at them. And so within this context, I think there's a lot of grist in terms of how we, grow and develop as men, especially householders, fathers, husbands. And, I just to connect back to the pause in the storm, I did a video around what I call the fundamental operating system, which is kind of the way that I see how I interact with the world around me. And it's this concept that I see life through these series of lenses that are my responsibility, that I've created, that I've distorted my view of the world through these lenses. And it's now my responsibility to kind of work back to get to kind of my pure essence and who I truly am. And, I've done another video on this, you can watch that, but essentially it's, that I have a lens that I developed very early on called the wound or some sort of trauma, where I experienced something, where we experienced something in early childhood that we're not able to really make sense of. We don't have the worldly experiences to make sense of. So we develop beliefs about the world based on a trauma, an event, a loss, something very painful, sad, angry, whatever. And we develop these beliefs about the world. And through those beliefs, we begin to start, looking through the world with now two lenses. And there are accompanying emotions that we begin to circle around. Like this starts to become an operating system where we sprinkle in, whether it be fear, anger, frustration, shame, guilt. And now we're kind of developing this pattern of this cocktail of emotions, these neurotransmitters, whether they be stressors. We start to develop these emotions that become, very common themes in our life, how we interact with, relationships, with challenges, with work, with whatever the world, however we're experiencing the world. And through those lenses, we will develop coping mechanisms, behaviors that we lean on, whether we lean on as men, substance is a big one for men. when we don't want to feel emotions that we feel are uncomfortable, anger, sadness, fear, shame, guilt, a lot of us will develop behaviors where we escape. We have some sort of resistance to feeling those emotions. So that could be leaning on substance. That could be leaning on, throwing ourselves into work, into hobbies, into exercise. It could be behavior in nature. It could be substance in nature, whether it be, drugs and alcohol, nicotine, whether it's calories, sugar. We tend to have, it's very easy for us to pick up these behaviors. And so for me, as I started to look at life and where my dysfunction, that was inside was probably informing much of my experience in the outside world, I developed a little tool because it was like I didn't have the strength to put things down 100%. So I developed a little tool that I called the pause in the storm. So it's like, okay, if I'm not ready to give up, alcohol or cannabis or nicotine or even work to some degree and exercise. I mean, I've been a workaholic, exerciseaholic, overachiever, all these things. But if I wasn't ready to give something up entirely, one of the tools that I developed was, okay, I want to learn a little bit about how this plays a role in my life. So I called it the pause in the storm, because what I would end up experiencing was like, okay, I'm going to put something down for a period of time. I'm going to titrate down this behavior, and I'm going to see what comes up. And essentially, the pause is when I began to pause a behavior or a substance. Say I wouldn't drink for a week or a month, or I wouldn't use cannabis for a period of time, or I wouldn't use nicotine, or I wouldn't, there was certain exercise. Okay, I'm going to put these things down. So the pause was to pause a potential behavior that I had suspected was doing something that was counterproductive for my evolution and my happiness and joy within my world. So I would pause that behavior and I would take note of what were the emotions that were coming up with the idea. Now, this might have been journaling. One of the tools I'll use, I'll just text myself, because then it's going to pop up in my text chain. It's just a text to me. And it's something I think you could probably do on iOS, on Apple and Android. So I would just text myself, like, I pause this for 12 days. These were the emotions that came up. And I would really try, like in meditation or in quiet moments, I would try to tack on, if there was a belief, if there was something that was repeating that I was hearing, I'm not safe without this, or I need this to self-regulate or self-soothe. The world is unsafe, or the world is unfair, or this person or this thing is, my job is blah, 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 my boss. It was a great tool for me to begin to understand, there's a lot more work to be done, because I do have kind of these emotions that continue to pop up systematically around different situations, different interactions, but where my experience of these situations and interactions was very similar. My inner environment was kind of very similar. So finding my beliefs, my limiting beliefs, and my repetitive thoughts and beliefs about either the world or myself or my place in it, and these kind of familiar emotions of fear, anger, sadness, whatever those were, shame, guilt. This was a great tool, and I think for a lot of guys who, we tend to isolate, or we tend to kind of take things, say, okay, we tend to have an inner dialogue of like, no one's ever experienced what I'm experiencing, whether it be with my family, with my job, with my health, with my finances. We tend to kind of internalize that and say, well, I must be the only one experiencing this. So before I was ready to look at how 12-step work can help me and benefit my life, or before I was ready to sit with any plant medicines, before I was ready to do any sort of couples counseling with my partner or individual therapy, or before I was actually ready to sit in a men's group, these were some of the tools that I kind of used as that buy-in of, oh shit, there's some work for me to do. There's a reason that every time I get a new job and the same patterns show up, or every time I get a new girlfriend, and open a new relationship, the same patterns, every time I, engage in anything new, like these same kind of themes were showing up. So this was a way for me, kind of as a DIY process, to kind of prove to myself that, okay, I've developed some bad habits that are holding me back in some way, that are helping me to kind of hold on to these limiting beliefs and these emotions that I resist feeling. There's a way that this kind of self-perpetuating loop, there's a way that I'm feeding into that. And so this was something I developed, years ago. And then, of course, I found later in the world that there are theories around this kind of same, how we use coping mechanisms to at some point like protect us from things that are uncomfortable and that we don't want to feel, but then how at some point on our journey they begin to hold us back or to keep us in this place. So then I read a book by a guy named Michael Singer, and he talks about a very similar situation. He calls them samskaras. So you can imagine kind of whether it, in the Christian tradition, it's called the Holy Spirit, it's chi, prana, kundalini, whatever. Like we have this life force that kind of, goes, that runs through us if we don't have blockages, or it runs partially through us if we have blockages, but that's available to all of us, right? This kind of this universal life force. And he likens it to, imagine, your life force is like a stream, and this flow, he says it wants to go from the root to the crown chakra. You can think of Holy Spirit in the Christian tradition, whatever. And he imagined all these little traumas, all these little, negative beliefs about ourselves, negative beliefs about the world, traumas, woundings, whatever, as kind of stones in this stream. And as that energy wants to flow through us, it's our God-given right. It's our natural right to have this life force within us. These as we store these samskaras, it's like the eddy. You can imagine a stream running with rocks in it. These rocks are going to create little eddies within the tide, and it's like the eddies is actually what we're experiencing. It's like the blockages with those samskaras, those stones in the river, in that life force, and the eddies that then will flow around that. And as we begin to pick up coping mechanisms, we smoke, we drink, we hide, we hide in our hobbies, we hide in work, or maybe we engage in illicit, illegal behaviors. But as we start to develop these coping mechanisms, they serve us to kind of keep us in that place where we re-traumatize ourselves. And it's really one of our goals in this journey, in this hero's journey, is to clear out those stones in the river, those samskaras, to clear out where that trauma lives, those limiting beliefs, so that we can, so that life force, imagine this is a stream with a current, that life force can flow, through us. It's kind of like, the human being can be seen kind of like as the gap in a spark plug. And when it's not corroded, that arcing, that energy can move freely between the diode, the electrode, whatever, and it can fire correctly, right, between this kind of grounding earth energy and this kind of cosmic energy. But, one of the DIY tools that I used was, before I was really bought into how if my life sucked, maybe it was something inside that was kind of driving that behavior. So, I've talked about in another videos a concept called redintegration, which is kind of the restoration of a former state when part of it is reintroduced. And I kind of talked about how, for me, I think those coping mechanisms, whether you busy yourself with hobby, you busy yourself with work, or you busy yourself with exercise or with substance, we lean on substance. These are all common for men. How those coping mechanisms can at some point begin to keep us in that state where we're in that arrested developmental state. And so for me, like, always going back to the fundamental operating system, like, what are my beliefs around this situation that are limiting? What are some of these beliefs that I want to start to get rid of? And how are my coping mechanisms kind of keeping that in my forefront? How are those coping mechanisms kind of keeping me in this place? And again, always going back to like, we have this kind of macro view of the hero's journey, which is like, we're born, we've got a story. At some point, it's going to potentially need to be rewritten. We're going to need to update our operating system. We're essentially the hero's journey. We're born. We begin to kind of know the environment we're in, and then all of a sudden we're separated. Right at 12 noon is when the hero's journey begins. We're separated from that, right? So you think of the transition from out of high school into the workforce, or into college into the workforce, the transition of getting married, having children, having a mortgage, the transition of having aging parents, or the transition of shifting jobs, careers. All of these transitions are going to ask more of us. And so while we kind of have this macro hero's journey in our life from the cradle to the grave, we also have these acute hero's journeys that we're constantly being challenged and need to develop a skill set, think differently, grow as a human. And how we handle these challenges, is obviously 100% up to us. Nobody's going to come rescue us. And I think, the tools that I put out on this channel really are tools I wish I had at the beginning, tools that I wish my younger self knew, because, having an easier time and having a more informed experience of what is that healing journey, what is it to take 100% responsibility for myself, my life, my actions, and these tools are out there. It depends on how you receive information. For me, it was very much do it myself at the beginning. It was very much, no one's ever had this experience that I'm having, So I was years away from being able to sit in a men's group, or go and take plant medicine, or go to couples counseling with my girlfriend, or, even walk into a 12-step room recognizing, oh shit, man, there's a room full of people that want to avoid the same thing I want to avoid. And they want to have a fulfilled, happy life. So I think some of these tools can really be helpful when you're in that place where you're kind of sick and tired of being sick and tired. And you're like, fuck, man, I'm sure there's some tools out there. So I hope you found this helpful.